To have a vote in a democracy is to wield power. It's to be an elector, someone to whom a government is answerable. But who should be allowed to vote in our democracies? The obvious answer is only over 18s, but this is a modern invention and the standard age used to be 21. Is there actually a strong argument for shutting out all under 18s from the political sphere? Or is this status quo not only suspicious, but inconsistent with our core democratic values? Hello and a huge welcome to Surprising Ethics, the podcast that promises you a surprising idea about ethics or political theory in every single episode. Please do hit that follow button to help make philosophy a bigger part of our political and individual conversations. I've got a really interesting conversation for you today with Dr. Isa Trifan, a lecturer in political philosophy at the University of Essex's Government Department. She writes about topics including justice, the family, and public policy, and has written a paper on the topic of lowering the voting age. Our conversation covers voting ages around the world, Trifan's case for lowering the voting age to an age bracket that will be revealed later, the idea of competence tests for voting rights, age discrimination, young people's distinctive political interests as against the interests of older people, the risk of poor quality voters entering our electoral role, and the risk to equality in trying to sift out quote-unquote poorer quality voters, whether really small kids should also be allowed to vote, the special goods of childhood and how politics might threaten these, and freedom in adolescence and whether we should fundamentally rethink the liberties that we afford to teenagers. I'm William Gilday, your host and a researcher in philosophy at McGill University, and thanks so much to the Centre for Research in Ethics, a Montreal-based academic research centre that supports this podcast. And a quick reminder that there's an ongoing survey so that I can have more of a conversation with you, my wonderful listener. So as always in Surprising Ethics, we look at the status quo first before looking at a surprising alternative coming out of the fields of political philosophy and ethics. And then we'll get into the broader conversation where the battle between the status quo and the surprising alternative plays out. So, what is the status quo about the voting age? The status quo says only over 18s should be able to vote. Status quo would emphasise responsibility and maturity as key values for being able to vote, and would say that it's doubtful that those under 18 have these characteristics. People who defend the status quo can acknowledge that some under 18s could definitely vote responsibly, but they think it's reasonable to have a hard cut-off point nonetheless, and that the agreed age of majority of adulthood should be where the line is drawn. As always, here are some clips to demonstrate the status quo. Starting with Channel 4 News, vox popping some voters from Bradford in the north of England.
So 16-year-olds voting, what do you reckon?
Ridiculous.
Why?
They've no life experience.
18, I think it's a nice age, but I think 16's just a bit too young for them.
The government has raised the age at which they can buy a lottery ticket. The government doesn't believe they can buy an alcoholic drink, so they wouldn't be able to celebrate or commiserate on the result of the election in which they just voted.
This is John Tongue, a professor of politics at Liverpool University.
The direction of public policy has been to raise trajectories upwards. The government isn't planning to introduce, for example, if you want a comparable civic responsibility, jury service for 16-year-olds. There has to be a cut-off point somewhere. The UK was the first state in the world to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. The rest of the world followed, and it was completely the right move to make. Why? Because there was an agreed age of adulthood. The United Nations defines adulthood as beginning at 18.
So the status quo says that votes only for over 18s is sensible, is safe, is measured, and that it can be a bit silly or even suspicious to try and lower the voting age below that point. And now for the surprising alternative, I bring you Isa Trifan. So welcome to all of you listening to this, and welcome to the first ever in-person recording of Surprising Ethics. I'm very fortunate to have over to my right Isa Trifan. And Isa, I wanted to start with a question about the status quo, the current laws worldwide. So I think most countries have 18 as the minimum voting age, but are there kind of outlier countries that have voting ages below or above that?
Thanks very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be on the podcast. So yes, you're right, of course, that most democracies around the world have 18 as their minimum voting age limit. But there are some interesting exceptions out there. You have countries where the minimum voting age is 16. Examples include Austria, Ecuador, Cuba, Brazil, and Argentina. You also have some places in the UK where 16-year-olds are allowed to vote. So in Scotland and Wales, 16-year-olds can vote to elect representatives to the Scottish and Welsh Parliament, respectively, and they can vote in their local elections. Some countries, on the other hand, place their voting limit above 18, sometimes well above 18. So in Singapore and Lebanon, for example, you have to be 21 to vote, and in the United Arab Emirates, you have to be as old as 25.
And moving to how you think the world should be, in a word, how far do you want to lower the voting age?
So I'm going to disappoint you a bit because I can't really answer that question in a word. Because it depends on the context and it depends on a number of factors that would be for policymakers to determine with any sort of precision. But just to give you a sense, I think that children between roughly, and I'm just giving this as sort of a range here, from 10 or perhaps from the age of 12 up to 16 should be able to vote if they pass a competence test. And then everyone, I think over 16, should get the unconditional right to vote. I don't see anything objectionable about the initiative that the current UK government has to lower the voting age in the UK from 18 to 16. I think there's absolutely no problem with that. And just to give you a sense of the range of options here, some political theorists suggest that we shouldn't have any sort of test, but rather that we should allow everyone to vote from the age of 12. Martin O'Neill, who's a political theorist at the University of York in the UK, for example, holds this view. And I'm very sympathetic to that proposal, actually. And since we're on surprising ethics here, let me admit that I'm even somewhat sympathetic to the proposal that we should lower the voting age to 6. David Runciman, to 6. David Runciman of Cambridge University, Daniel Weinstock of McGill University, they're strong proponents of this because they argue that the abilities required for the right to vote are very minimal indeed. Basically, they think anyone who can hold a pen and who can express an independent preference between, two political options put in front of them should be allowed to vote. So you can see how even 6-year-olds arguably are capable of voting in this sense. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to this, though one reason I hesitate is that I think that giving the vote to very young children might expose them ultimately to certain risks of harm that I think we should be worried about, even if it's true that they technically have the sort of basic voting capacity.
Right, so if you're sympathetic to those ideas, why insist on a test, right? What's the argument for lowering the age at which people could vote, but only if they pass this kind of competence exam?
So I argue for a competence test here, partly in order to appease the critics of votes for children, basically. So those who are against giving the vote to children often point out, of course, as you might expect, nothing's going to be surprising here. They point to their lack of political competence, right? They'll say, look, 12-year-olds don't really understand politics. They don't have enough knowledge about the world or about politics. They're immature. Their vote would be based on irrelevant considerations, such as, I don't know, which candidate has the best suit or the best smile. And to this, many of those in favor of votes for children reply, what? Unlike the rest of us, do you mean? Because we know that many adults can also be described that way, right? Many of us don't have enough knowledge about politics. Many of us are immature. Many of us base our vote on all sorts of irrelevant considerations, such as which candidate is most charming. I myself, can I really say that I've done my due diligence every time I went out to vote? No, I really can't say that. So defenders of voting rights for children point out that there seems to be a sort of double standard at work, where we point to the attributes that an ideal voter should have, such as solid political knowledge and maturity, when it comes to excluding children, but we're not prepared to apply the same standard to adults. Because if we did, it looks like we'd have to exclude very many adults from the vote as well. Now, critics of votes for children have the following reply to that. They say, look, we're not applying a double standard as such. We're merely using age as a proxy for what really matters, which is voter competence. And we care about voter competence because voting, at the end of the day, is a serious and potentially dangerous undertaking in the sense that it can result in outcomes that are potentially dangerous for all of us, right? But the critics say this is not applying a double standard. It's simply accepting that using age as an indicator is an imperfect policy device, but it's the best we've got. So, of course, one question that arises here is using age as a proxy for competence justified? In my paper, I adopt a slightly different strategy. The question asked is this. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that voting requires some form of more advanced competence, such that a majority of people under 18 count as incompetent, and a majority of people over 18 do count as competent. Is it then justified to deny the right to vote to everyone under 18? And my answer is no. Even if it were true that most people under 18 counted as politically incompetent, we know there are always some young people who count as competent. And my thought is simply that it's unjust to deny the vote to those few young people, however few they are, who are competent just because a majority of their age group peers might be incompetent. Why not let them show that they're qualified by making available to them a political competence test, right? So this test would be entirely optional. Children could request it, and they could take it in their school, and those who would pass could get their right to vote earlier than their peers.
Great, wonderful. So let me do a kind of botched job summary, if I may, and then you'll tell me whether it's right. So basically those who are in favour of votes for kids say, look, there's just a double standard here, right? Like, we're allowing some adults to vote when they're actually not competent in the relevant sense. They don't have the relevant skill set or knowledge to vote responsibly. And yet we're shutting out all under 18s because we think that on average or in general, they're not competent. And then the defenders of the status quo come along and say, well, hang on a minute. The 18-year-old threshold is the best policy mechanism we have, right? We know that most kids are not competent in the relevant sense. Most adults are competent to wield this power over others. So let's keep things how they are. And then you come along and say, well, it might be the case, right, that the age proxy is pretty good. But the problem is you're still then excluding some children and adolescents from the electoral roll without a good reason, right? Because we could have a test which says, let's level up the rights of those adolescents and kids who can prove that they have the relevant competency, rather than just saying, well, I'm sorry, for the sake of convenience or tradition or historical precedent, we're just going to exclude all under 18s. Is that basically the argument?
That's exactly right, and you certainly did a much better job than I did at trying to summarize it.
Oh no, it's your material. But yeah, thanks. So okay, next question is, I guess, about why this is an important political issue. What's the case for this being something that we should focus on and try and correct in reality? I can imagine some people thinking, look, the argument's about age discrimination and how we should avoid it. But some people might think age discrimination is a really bad thing in some cases, like when older women, for example, are kind of ignored, set aside, not taken that seriously anymore in a really unfair and pernicious way. But in this case, the age discrimination seems pretty temporary. It seems quite minor. It seems that there isn't much material benefit to having the vote only later on in life. And there isn't some mass movement of teenagers demanding the vote. And we all get there in the end, right? We all have to wait, but then we all get there in the end and we're given the vote when we reach 18. And so why is it a big deal that adolescents have to wait a bit longer before they can vote?
In general, it seems to me that if a person is discriminated against for being part of a certain group, we don't normally inquire into how much of a difference it would actually make to their lives if they weren't discriminated against, right? We just think it's unjust that they're discriminated against for being part of a certain group, and it's a matter of respect for the person for us to avoid doing that. If a public library put up a sign saying, "Oh, welcome to use our books this year, apart from Eastern Europeans because we know most of them are untrustworthy," or something, we would think that was wrong. That was discriminatory against me as an Eastern European woman, right? Even if I still have the chance to use the library the next year, and even if I wasn't planning to use that particular library this year and, I can use it next year, we still think that would be unjust. The point is really about due respect for people's rights, and it's problematic for liberal democratic societies to dismiss out of hand the injustice of denying a qualified person their fundamental democratic right to have a say, and to just say, well, you'll vote later on, so you don't lose much, as it were. And here's a second point. Sometimes it can matter very much whether children or adolescents have the right to vote at a particular point in time, and it does matter very much whether they miss a crucial opportunity to cast a vote. The Brexit vote here in the UK is probably one such example, right? So sometimes there are elections that are extremely consequential, particularly for the young. So then it really might matter a whole deal whether all the young people who qualify to vote are allowed to have their say at that particular time.
Right, yeah. And I think in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in France, and in many other countries, according to Our World in Data, the older you get, the more likely you are to actually cast a vote. And that trend continues right until people are in their 70s or 80s, right? When obviously, I guess, maybe some mobility issues kick in for some older people. And so if our democracies are slanted towards older people, that then is reflected in policy making. And maybe some issues like climate change or like the catastrophic effects that AI development or certain forms of AI development could have on the future, maybe those aren't at the top of voters' minds when they're in their older years. But for young people, they are absolutely essential, right? And so I guess maybe another benefit of your policy, just if you want to talk about concrete benefits, and you've done a good job of explaining why it's not all about concrete benefits, we might want to broaden the franchise for that kind of reason too, to kind of better reflect the interests of all age groups.
I think you touched on two very important points there that proponents of voting rights for children often emphasize. One is that voting is a matter of habit, and that it is really important to get people to vote at the first opportunity that they have to do so. And some people argue that it would be much easier to get people voting if they're still in school, for example, and before they reach such a tumultuous, if you will, age as 18 when, they have a lot of things on their mind. They might be moving out of their homes for the first time. They might be going to university. They might be considering what job to take up. They might be in flux in very many ways that mean that if the first opportunity you have to vote is at age 18, you might miss that opportunity, and then it's harder, as it were, to get into it. So the earlier we get people voting, the better for the turnout of young people, which, as you mentioned, is notoriously low compared to the turnout of older voters. And then the second thing you pointed out there is that indeed many people think that the voting outcomes that we can see in many societies reflect disproportionately the interests of the older populations, partly because they do go out to vote more. And many people see enfranchising the young as an opportunity to start to redress a little bit what they see as a bit of an intergenerational imbalance in terms of policy outcomes.
So in the rest of the episode, I've got a kind of a trio of objections against your view to discuss. So one concerns the risk of incompetent voters, another concerns possible inegalitarianism in the system, and then the last one concerns smaller kids and why they shouldn't be able to take a test. And then we're going to get into some broader issues, I think, freedom in adolescence and about other age limits that we impose on young people. So with examples being joining the army, drinking alcohol, and driving. So first of all, what would a voting competence test look like? Like, how would we do this? How would we make this test work? And of course, we want to make it work. Otherwise, maybe a lot of incompetent voters would get kind of slipped through the net and would risk the quality of policy making. So the question for you is, what would be on the test? And why isn't it the case that we're just unable ever to devise a reliable test that's kind of widely accepted and seen as valid?
As you very rightly say, the answer depends very much on exactly what we think political competence requires. It might be quite hard, indeed, to test for whether someone is mature as such. I don't know exactly what that test would look like. And whether it would be accepted by society. But at the same time, it doesn't seem that hard at all to test for whether someone has the capacity to identify reasons for and against a political choice. And it doesn't seem hard to ask someone to explain their reasoning for a political choice, for example, right? And one point I wanna make here is that we already have competence tests in other areas of law and policy that we do seem to accept and people do seem to think are legitimate. So in the UK, for example, there's the 2005 Mental Capacity Act that makes provisions for persons who lack the capacity to make decisions for themselves. So if a person fails the mental capacity test, they are appointed a guardian with the power of attorney to make life decisions on their behalf. So this is a very important test with huge implications. It's much more consequential for someone's life compared to the test that decides whether they should get the vote or not. And yet we seem to think that this is a feasible and legitimate thing to do.
This is like for people with dementia, right? When their son or daughter might take over their financial affairs and their medical decisions and stuff for them when they have dementia, right?
Exactly right. And in fact, this mental capacity test is not a bad model for how we might design the voter competence test. Of course, not one-to-one, but it's a good starting point. Just like the mental capacity test, the voter competence test might include a set of questions that aim to establish whether a person can understand, retain, and weigh up relevant information for making a decision, and for communicating that reasoning. So a similar test could be devised for political competence, and it could be something that children can request and be given in school, much like they do many other tests.
So the next objection is you can acknowledge that it's important to keep incompetent voters out. And that's one reason why you don't want to go for the kind of blanket cut of 6 years old, where every 6-year-old has an unconditional right to vote. So we want to keep incompetent voters out. But also you said that some adults don't have the relevant political competencies to vote responsibly. So then the question is, why not give all adults a test before they can vote? But that would seem undesirable and quite an egalitarian right to say every single adult has no right to vote unless they can pass a competence test. So how would you exactly avoid sliding into that kind of an egalitarian view?
So yes, if we accept the proposition, as I do in my paper for the sake of argument, that society has a strong interest in keeping incompetent people from getting the vote, then there is a strong sort of prima facie reason to give everyone a test, including adults. But I also think there are some very good countervailing reasons not to do so, all things considered. One such reason has to do with the expressive harm involved in denying, say, a 35-year-old the vote on the grounds that they lack basic political competence. I think that denying a 35-year-old the vote on these grounds would be demeaning because we have very good reason to expect that by the age of 35, virtually all adults will have developed the capacities required for political competence. And being denied the vote at that age, after failing a test, could significantly undermine a person's self-respect, and might also provoke a judgmental or even indifferent attitude towards them in others. But I think the same is not necessarily true of 12-year-olds, right? So denying some of them the vote, if they fail the test, does not necessarily communicate a deficiency as such. It doesn't communicate something that should undermine their self-respect, right? If a young person gets the right to vote earlier than their peers, the message being sent is more likely to be that person is exceptional. And we do tend to recognize children's and teenagers' exceptional qualities in other areas in all sorts of ways, right? Including by giving them special prizes when they achieve exceptional results in school, and by allowing, for example, gifted children to skip grades in school.
So let's turn now to like toddlers or 5-year-old children or 8-year-old children. Why not allow these small kids to vote if they could pass the competence test? Because obviously your argument for broadening the voter base to include kids appeals to the importance of avoiding age discrimination, right? Like it's age discrimination to say to a 14-year-old, you will have no say in how society is run regardless of your mental capacities. But isn't it age discrimination to say that you have to be 10 years old, 12 years old, or something like this before even being able to sit the test?
In a nutshell, I do think that younger children who would qualify do have a claim to the vote, just like older children do, just like teenagers do. Mm-hmm. But I also think that the younger the child is that we're considering here, the stronger the paternalistic reasons we have, essentially to protect them from the world of politics. Right. One worry is that giving younger children the right to vote might not be in their best interest, all things considered, because the right to vote might undermine what some philosophers call the special goods of childhood. Right. So theorists like Anka Gyaush talk about goods that as children we have unique access to, which cannot be deferred and they cannot be compensated for later in life, and which make our lives go better overall, right? So examples might include having fully trusting, intimate relationships of a kind and quality that us adults are not capable of. Playfulness and carefreeness, as well as a sense of one's future as limitless. All these things, all these goods of childhood might be undermined if we invite young children to engage with what can be very nasty business politics, right? So they would have to get informed about harrowing issues like genocide, war, all sorts of human rights violations. And they might feel a certain kind of responsibility for making hard decisions, right, about what direction society should go in. And the thought is that placing this kind of responsibility on the shoulders of young children and asking them to get informed about such harrowing issues really might undercut essentially their innocence, their playfulness, their kind of spontaneous trust in other people and especially in us adults.
Right, yeah. And your paper also got me thinking about whether we've got it wrong when it comes to adolescence and freedoms, the legal freedoms that we afford these young people. So, for example, we give people an unlimited right to social media when they're teenagers, and yet zero say in how society is run on their behalf, in part. And so in the case of voting, you suggest moving away from sharp blanket age cutoff points towards a more individualized model. So rather than saying 18 is the age at which you can vote, full stop, we say many young people can apply to have a special cutoff point for them instituted because they want to and can show that they have passed the relevant competencies. And I wonder whether we should take a similarly individual approach with respect to certain other rights and freedoms for adolescents. So I have 3 examples in mind: the right to buy and drink alcohol, the right to join the army without parental agreement, and the right to drive. At the moment, all these 3 things have sharp blanket cutoff points. In the UK, it's 17 for driving and 18 for joining the army without parental agreement and buying alcohol. So is there a case for a more individualized approach? For example, saying that at a certain age, we're going to give these freedoms unconditionally, but before that age, we're going to allow people to apply to show that they're competent to have those freedoms.
This will probably sound quite unsatisfying, but I think the way we should ultimately treat children, the rights and freedoms they should be granted, and when, and under what conditions, these decisions require us to balance a number of considerations against one another on a case-by-case basis. So there is no simple answer to this. But one relevant consideration, right, that would have to be considered here is it feasible that we can design a reliable test for the relevant capacities in each case? Right? So in the case of the right to drink alcohol that you mentioned, we might doubt that there's a feasible way to test for how someone will actually react to being exposed to alcohol. Would they be able to stop and show moderation once they're given full freedom? How might their bodies react? It would be very hard to test for that. Whereas I think it's much more plausible that we can reliably test for things like a decent understanding of politics or the ability to reason minimally well. Another relevant consideration is the risk of harm involved in getting it wrong. If we get it wrong with the voter competence test and we end up giving the vote to an incompetent 13-year-old or a few, not much harm is actually going to come from that because the impact of a few individual votes is negligible. We know that. But if we get it wrong and we allow a young person to go to war or to start drinking or to drive or to get married before they're actually minimally competent to make those decisions, the potential harms that could come to them as well as to other people are enormous, right? Like the potential for harm is catastrophic here. So the harms involved in getting it wrong with a test, I think, recommend taking a much more cautious approach when it comes to a lot of these rights compared to the right to vote. And a final consideration, again, there has to be balanced, is this. Just how weighty is the claim that a young person has to enjoy a particular freedom or right in the first place? I'd argue that the right to have a say in a democracy, if one is qualified, is a very weighty one, because given the way that our democracies have evolved, the right to vote is very strongly associated with being recognized as an equal in society, right? This right, the right to vote, is emblematic of our equal status as citizens. By contrast, I don't know, the freedom to start drinking earlier than your peers, or even the freedom to go to war, I would say are arguably less central to people's lives and less able to sort of outweigh, if you will, these other considerations that might count against them.
Great, thank you. And a final point, a final objection. If the point is to acknowledge the status of young people as kind of full citizens, as individuals worthy of societal respect, doesn't insisting that they take a test when the rest of us aren't required to take any test undermine that goal, right? So how is it helping young people to feel like they're treated as equals when in fact, in a way, they aren't, right? That they're given a test and the rest of us aren't inspected or evaluated or judged or put through our paces in order to exercise our share of political power?
Right. Yes, that's a very good question. And I think perhaps now is a good time to remind the listeners that my aims in defending this proposal are really only very limited. Again, I'm very sympathetic in principle to proposals that we should just lower the voting age, say, to 12 or some such similar age, and just give everyone the right to vote unconditionally. But in this paper, I simply wanted to concede as much ground as possible to the critics of such proposal. And my point was only to say, if we're really keen on making sure we're not allowing new voters in who are incompetent, one thing we can do is to ask young people to sit a test to assuage that worry, if you will. We don't have to resort to excluding all children from the vote. And I think this is an improvement compared to the status quo. Because the status quo tells all children, we don't care that you're citizens like the rest of us. We don't care that you're impacted by political decisions like the rest of us. We don't even care that some of you might be more informed, more engaged, and more intelligent than a lot of us adults. We don't care that you might miss the opportunity to vote in some potentially life-changing elections. We will deny all of you the vote because some, or even many of you, tend to lack political competence. I think it's an improvement to say to them instead, look, it may be the case that a lot of you tend to lack political competence, but we take your democratic rights seriously enough to make an effort to give those of you who are politically competent the recognition that you're due.
Wonderful, thank you. And I should remind all my wonderful listeners who I'm very lucky to have, so thank you all, that there's a survey still available, still open, in the episode description of, I think, any episode, where you can give me your feedback so that I can improve the podcast and make it suit your interests and preferences to a higher degree. There's going to be a third episode touching on issues concerning young people, probably on the 1st of April, concerning the manosphere and its toxic effects, not only on women, but on the men who are sucked into this world. So that will either be the 1st of April or the 1st of May. And otherwise, it just remains to thank Isa so much for coming. So yeah, thank you so much for this first ever in-person recording. And it's been great to have you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.